This is Inside the Courtroom, the Chad Daybell trial, and we're glad you're here with us. This week, day 25 of the Daybell trial is when we saw prosecutors wrap up their evidence. They finished their case against Chad Daybell, the defendant accused of 3 murders. And it was an interesting week. Morgan Romero here with me. She was in the courtroom this week and here to kind of help break down some of the evidence that we heard. Some of the testimony that we heard. Let's start with just, it was prosecution rested, nothing too unusual or different in terms of their closing arguments. Yeah. Just trying to explain that they feel very strongly about the fact that they laid the evidence that Chad Daybell was both connected to all of these murders and very much a part of planning them and a part of executing them.
Exactly. Yeah, the conspiracy charge also involved
Absolutely.
too.
And then we saw, it's not unusual at all to have a defense attorney at that point in the trial is the time when most always a defense team is going to motion the judge and try to say the prosecution did not prove the case. And in fact, judge, you need to rule based on the evidence you heard that there's no evidence here that this crime was committed or that this defendant is responsible. The judge said he was ready to rule on that, but then came a couple of tense moments in the courtroom when there was an issue with a date on Daybell's indictment from February, I believe.
Exactly.
So tell us what happened.
So, yeah, he moved, John Pryor, his defense attorney, moved for a motion for acquittal, and Judge Boyce said, I'm ready to make a motion on that. However, that said, I caught something. So this is not something the defense caught. This is something that Judge Stephen Boyce caught. I caught that in the amended indictment, which was amended in February of this year, the date on count 4, which is the murder of JJ Vallow, says that JJ was murdered on September 8th or 9th of 2019. Right. That we know is not what prosecutors actually believe. They have argued all along, all the evidence they presented throughout this trial has been that he was murdered. They believe he was murdered on September 22nd or 23rd. Right. What had happened was prosecutors had made a clerical error. So September 8th and 9th is when they believe Tylee was murdered. Right. And her count lays that out. Something happened when they changed this governing charging document, and they put that the dates JJ was murdered were actually the dates Tylee was murdered. So what could have potentially happened, it could have been really bad for that charge against JJ where the judge had an opportunity to rule on this and say, it's too late. The prosecution has rested, and under Idaho criminal rules, we can't change an indictment once the prosecution rests their case. And so jurors have to take this information, and it would be really confusing for them, and this is not what they've heard. And so he could have acquitted Chad on that count. That's not what happened. He was able to make a motion make a ruling after hearing arguments presented by the defense and the prosecution yesterday afternoon after the jurors were gone. He heard arguments from both sides, and he did agree with prosecutors that this was a clerical mistake, and he will find a way to remedy this. He wasn't ready to make a decision on what he was going to do, but his options are give the jury instructions that this was a mistake and everything that they heard, take that to September 22nd and 23rd dates, not the 8th and 9th in the document, or he will formally amend the indictment himself. Right. And so, or prosecutors will. We'll see. So remains to be seen. But all that to say, this motion for acquittal on that count and all the other counts was denied. So JJ's case still is involved.
And it is not horribly uncommon. I mean, it equates to a typographical error that where if you're copying, kind of like a copy and paste, you get the dates wrong, you move something down in a document, you don't take the right information. Now, clearly, you do not want to risk, the last thing prosecutors want is some sort of, small error, typing error on a form to cause you to lose the ability to prosecute on this charge. So fortunate for them, of course, that didn't happen, but it was. I know there was some tension in the courtroom, and certainly those affected closely by this case were real worried for a little bit.
They were shocked, and there were 4 of them, and to John Pryor's point, he was like, there are 4 prosecutors that didn't catch this. Nobody caught this. Yeah. No journalists. I don't know when Judge Boyce caught it, but he couldn't bring it up until apparently this point, potentially because John Pryor opened the door for this. But nobody caught it prior, and prosecutors had a couple hours to get their case together to study case law and present this, but we interviewed JJ's grandpa, Larry Woodcock, and he was really emotional. He was like, I think this is a technical issue, but we deserve justice for JJ. He's the most innocent in all of this. Because, last thing I'll say about it is, like, if Chad Daybell is convicted and they sentence him to death,
right,
he would have gotten sentenced and convicted on 2 other murder charges if this was tossed out, right? So his sentence doesn't change.
Right.
But all that to say, family members and people who are really attached to this case would think, is there no justice for JJ now?
Right. And it's almost like the little asterisk that goes on the case that says, wait, it should have been different. And certainly his grandfather would have felt like that, that we should have had the opportunity to have a conviction. I mean, in his mind, in his world, we should have had the opportunity. And we lost that because of a date that was wrong on a piece of paper.
Right.
And so you can imagine how that might have felt. Now, what was interesting, too, is prosecutors brought back 2 witnesses that we've heard from previously in this case. And that was the lead detective on this case, Hermosillo, and then former FBI agent Doug Hart. And I think we want to pay attention to some of the testimony from Doug Hart, which happened just before prosecutors decided to rest their case against Chad Daybell. And what I think is most interesting about this is this was the moment, the first time really we were able to see a very chronological order of texts. And these messages are from Alex to Lori, Chad to Lori, Lori to Chad. And so we've heard so much about all the different stories that Chad and Lori have shared with multiple people.
Right.
But now these are the 3 people closest that we know of that are the closest to everything that happened.
Co-conspirators.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is our opportunity to kind of get inside what they were telling each other. So let's listen. And this first set of messages that Doug Hart is testifying about is from March of 2019. And this is between Lori and Alex Cox. Now, this is her brother. And they're talking about a plan.
And Agent Hart, can you indicate who these messages were being sent from, who these messages were being sent between?
These are messages between Lori Vallow and her brother, Alex Cox.
And can you read the date of these messages into the record?
These 3 messages are from March 20th of 2019.
When we look at these particular messages, what about them caught your attention?
Alex Cox was a figure during the course of our investigation, and what caught my attention about this particular interaction between Lori Vallow and Alex Cox is in line 1837 that Lori Vallow had to check everything with her, quote, source to make sure she had her information correct, but that it was really good.
Did this indicate to you that Lori herself didn't have this information?
Yes, that's why I think it's significant.
And did you also see in here that Lori was then going to pass that information on to Alex?
Yes.
Did you learn through the investigation who Lori's source was?
Foundation.
Sustain.
Through the investigation, did you see messages from Lori to Chad quite frequently?
Very frequently.
In those messages, was she oftentimes requesting information?
Yes.
And moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, would you indicate the date these were sent into the record?
Yes. These 4 text messages were sent on July 18th of 2019.
What had happened 7 days prior to these messages?
Lori Vallow's husband, Charles Vallow, had been shot and killed.
Through your investigation, did you learn who Hillary was a reference to?
Yes.
And who was that?
Tylee.
And there's also a name in here, Raphael. Did you learn who Raphael referred to?
Raphael is a name, another name used by Chad Daybell between he and Lori Vallow very frequently throughout the course of their communications.
And also a name, James. Do you know who that referred to?
Yes, that is another name for Chad Daybell as referenced in the James and Elena communications between Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell.
It's almost as if they had another language. So
Absolutely.
everyone had a different name. So
Yeah.
Alex, they called him Ray
Ray.
Lamar. James was another name for Chad.
Yeah.
Elena was another name for Lori. Hillary was, and so you start to see these names pop up, and you'll hear more of this because this continues. Calling Tammy, they have different names and different ways of referencing Tammy.
Right. And the way they refer to themselves is very different.
Right.
These alter names that they have for other people are because these people are possessed and they're
Right.
zombies. So these are the names that they give the like dark spirits, the demons that have taken over the lives of the people that ultimately lost their lives.
Right. So we start to see this pattern. This pattern starts to, and this is the very first time that we get to see this timeline, but we see they're talking about a plan, and then Charles Vallow is shot and killed
Yep.
by Alex Cox in Lori's home in Arizona. And so then we have a week after that happens, now we know that Charles Vallow is dead, and now we see this interaction between Lori and Chad. After this, now what's next? It seems that they have another step in the plan that they're ready for, right, the next step, and to see what happens now. So we'll listen to this.
In the prior slide, Chad Daybell had indicated that they would have this time together Wednesday through Friday. And Lori Vallow's response to that is, then what? And she then says, back to crying and saying goodbye, back to the box, as a reference to being trapped with their inability to be together.
And at this point in time, Charles Vallow has been killed,
This is 1 week following his death.
but Tammy's still alive.
Correct.
And what was the second thing?
The second thing is line 2603, which is Chad Daybell's response to her. And he references that extreme changes are coming for him, and he welcomes those changes.
And do you recall from previous testimony references Chad also made about feeling trapped?
Judge, I'm going to object. It's leading.
Overruled.
Yes,
And do you recall approximately, or do you recall what those statements were, what that was in reference to?
yes, that conversation took place at the conclusion of this trip that they're talking about. So that would have been on July 26th of 2019, where Chad Daybell references the Harry Potter stories and feeling trapped, having to live under a stairwell, and he gets to escape occasionally to have adventures with his goddess lover.
And when you look at that line 2603, there's a reference to extreme changes. Did that catch your attention?
It did.
What did you, through your investigation and experience, what did you believe that to be in reference to?
Judge, calling for speculation. Objection.
Overruled.
Well, within 3 months of this date, Tylee, JJ, and Tammy are all dead.
So FBI agent, former FBI agent Doug Hart talking about, putting together those pieces. And from an investigative standpoint, we're talking about feeling trapped. We're talking about extreme changes coming in. Then within 3 months,
Right.
these 3 people are dead. The 3 people that they have referenced as being dark, evil, and keeping them from being together.
Right. I mean, that's the biggest takeaway from this, right? Is that, and you'll hear this if you watch all of Doug Hart's testimony, but Lori and Chad want to live this fantasy life together, unencumbered, free from their spouses, free from Lori's children. And that is what the prosecution is claiming. And that's why they say they did what they did. But I think the biggest thing is Chad, you'll see a theme throughout this, is
Right.
that he is spoken to, or he can speak beyond the veil and talk to those who have moved on and who are dead. And these claims that he's making about extreme changes, or I learned this,
Right.
or it's it's his level of spirituality and his religious knowledge that prosecutors and key witnesses are claiming he uses to manipulate Lori and others in his life. And that's been something that they've been pushing all along. And Doug Hart testified to this. Ray Hermosillo testified to this, multiple law enforcement officers who went through all of their communication. It's Lori always turning to Chad. It's everybody always turning to Chad and saying, well, what does this mean? What were you told? What religious knowledge do you have?
Because he is the one who said he has this portal.
Right.
He has this portal to be able to hear from people. He has this portal to be able to understand what should happen. And you can't help but notice that, you have this divine intervention, if you will, and yet whose hands were on a shovel to bury a child's body in that backyard.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's the question, obviously, that prosecutors want jurors to consider and to determine exactly. And also pointing out, too, that, as we've said all along, is the defense, the thing that they have really presented over and over is that, hinting at, I guess, and we'll see what they do with their case when they open next week, but is that Chad isn't the one in charge here, or he's not the one who has made this happen, that it was, in fact, Lori who was the one that manipulating him, coming on to him and really trying to woo him in her direction. And so this next piece of these next text messages are Doug saying clearly that what he's reading in these texts is that Lori is looking to Chad for what do we do now?
Lori Vallow is asking Chad Daybell if there is a, quote, perfectly orchestrated plan to take the children.
What is Chad's response?
Chad's response is that there is a plan being orchestrated for the children.
Where were Tylee and JJ's remains ultimately located?
On Chad Daybell's property.
And moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, is this also a continuation from some of the previous slides?
Yes, it is.
Who are these messages being sent between?
Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell.
What about these particular messages stood out to you in relation to the investigation?
Well, first off is line 1159. In the previous slide, there was a question about a plan and a verification of a plan. Then Lori Vallow asks Chad Daybell, what should I be doing? And in the subsequent line, 1158, Chad Daybell provides an answer to her, which concludes with being unencumbered and fully free.
There's also a reference in that to telestial issues. Do you know through the investigation what telestial would be referencing?
I do.
What is that?
Issues pertaining to this earthly life.
And in some of the previous messages, Lori was inquiring about the death percentages of Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow.
That's correct.
What else stood out in relation to these messages?
Line 1155 is very critical. Chad Daybell texts Lori Vallow and indicates that JJ is, quote, getting close. When I was sitting across from him eating bacon, I sensed he was barely attached to his body.
Do you know when the last time JJ Vallow was seen?
I do.
When was that?
September 22nd, 2019.
Death percentages.
Yeah.
Telestial life.
Yeah.
We heard several text messages referencing death percentages and being 3%. We heard Tammy's death percentage. We heard about Tylee's and JJ's and Chad always being the one that provided those.
He was the one that Lori, throughout all of the evidence presented, would turn to, and Lori would say, how close is this person getting to death? How close? Even talking about her nephews. And Chad would have this sort of power from afar to turn up the pain and decrease the pain tolerance, these sorts of things, and already pretty damning to talk about hurting kids. In one instance, Lori was in the car with kids, including her nephews and niece. It was her niece, Melanie Boudreau's kids.
Right. So it's great
Yeah,
niece.
exactly. And Chad, she's saying, gosh, I can't stand it. And Chad's saying, I'll give him something to scream about.
Yeah.
And so the prosecution, of course, uses that and says, well, look, he's willing to inflict pain. And Doug Hart testified to that. But yeah, Chad is the one with these death percentages. But what's interesting is there's inconsistencies.
Right.
And Hart pointed this out because the prosecutor asked about this. He said sometimes the higher the death percentage, the closer they were to death. Sometimes the lower the percentage, the closer they were to death. And of course, we know these people didn't die from natural causes.
Right.
So what does that mean when somebody's close to death?
And we think that they have referenced this as the zombies taking over,
Exactly.
meaning that their earthly body, and he talks about how it doesn't seem like he's attached to his body.
Celestial in the Mormon
Right.
faith and the LDS faith, that's what they refer to as earthly. Yeah.
Right. So thinking that potentially the idea being that the body is here, but their spirit has been overtaken. They're no
Right.
longer actually alive as the person that we know them.
Right. And Lori is always looking to him. I mean, when Chad says, I was eating bacon
Yeah.
with him and he was barely attached to his body, he said the same thing about Tammy.
Right.
We'll talk about that in a moment. But when somebody is acting some type of way, and they reference this a lot in the messages that were shown, one of Melanie Boudreau's children drawing crosses in the room and having to paint over them and not acting like themselves, and Lori saying that they're clearly possessed, and Chad confirming that, right? And what do we do now moving forward?
Well, and it's in all of the people that were sort of in their way or encumbering them. We saw percentages of death for Charles Vallow. We heard them talk about percentages of death for Brandon Boudreau. We know that he was shot at or believed to be
tried to kill him,
exactly
yeah.
tried to kill him. Melanie Boudreau's child. We talked about, and then Tammy Daybell, JJ Vallow, Tylee Ryan. Of those 6 people that were referenced, 4 of them are dead.
Yeah. It's a path of destruction, and they have the evidence. And it's important to point out, Chad is not, he hasn't been indicted and he's not been involved in the Charles Vallow murder, but Lori has, and her brother was.
Yeah.
And so it's all these people connected
Right.
to them as well.
And there was definitely the same talk.
Yes.
And Chad was certainly a part of the mix.
Yes.
Before Charles Vallow's death. And so, yes.
they were having an affair when it happened.
Circumstantial evidence, but there is definitely, like we said before, in the start of this, is that there's definitely seems to be a pattern. So now we know after these text messages, a short time later, we know that JJ and Tylee are missing, later found dead, buried on Chad Daybell's property. So the final person now encumbering or holding him hostage and not able to be with his
Goddess
lover, exactly, as referenced earlier in the Harry Potter series. And so now we see then evidence and text messages. We first heard about messages sent within 24 hours of Tammy being found dead in her home. Chad Daybell, of course, reporting that she died in her sleep at some point during the night. So within 24 hours of that, Doug Hart was able to find the messages where Chad is eager to get Lori back here to Idaho, and Lori eager to get Chad to Kauai, where she had been a part. We talked in our last episode that this was a time when we understood that Alex was going to be in Hawaii, on the island of Kauai, with Lori, but so was told that he needed to be back in Idaho to help Chad with something, right? Chad needed help with something. We know that was the week in which Tammy Daybell was found dead in her home. And so we start seeing the messages within 24 hours, we want to be together. And then just 4 days later, they're talking about how they're going to do this, what's going to happen next.
In line 515, you have Lori Vallow indicating how consuming her love is for Chad Daybell. And then of note, line 514, Chad Daybell responds, "I know exactly how you feel. I'm feeling sad, but it isn't for the reason everyone thinks!" Exclamation point.
Through the investigation, did you learn what the connection between Alex Cox and Chad Daybell was?
Yes.
What was that?
Alex Cox was an adherent of Chad
Judge,
Daybell.
objection, argumentative.
Sustain.
Did Chad beat Alex through Lori?
Yes,
Based on your investigation, review of messages, and other things, would Alex do as Chad asked?
Judge, objection, argumentative.
Overruled.
yes,
Did Tammy Daybell know Alex Cox based on what you learned in the investigation?
no, she did not.
Was the only connection between Tammy and Alex Chad?
Correct.
Moving to the next slide, I'm going to pause to allow the jurors to read. And Agent Hart, can you indicate the date these messages were exchanged?
Yes, October 23rd of 2019.
And who were the messages being exchanged between?
Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell.
And do you recall in a previous slide talking about a message where Alex was going to be told information also?
Yes.
What about these messages stood out to you in relation to the investigation?
In relation to the investigation, primarily lines 482 and 481 stood out to me. In line 482, Lori Vallow indicates she's had a bad dream about Al. And primarily line 481, Lori indicates that Alex Cox would be the one they use to get us both. All this alone time is not good for him. So something that Alex Cox knows is a risk to Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell.
So a risk. Now they're talking about Alex being
Getting in their way.
yeah,
Yeah.
and having too much information that is
Right.
going to be that could potentially cause them trouble. And Alex knew that.
He knew that. And Zulema, his wife, testified earlier in this trial that he had told her, I think I'm their fall guy. I am either a man of God or I am not. And we talked about this here on Inside the Courtroom. But Alex, the allegation and the theory is that Alex is the one who carried out these killings on behalf of Chad and Lori. I mean, Chad potentially played some part in it, is what they're alleging, physically, right?
Right.
Because, and I think, just going back to this, a sidebar, the same thing that happened during Lori's trial, we will not learn exactly how
Right.
and who was physically there. But the thought is Alex certainly was with Tylee and certainly was with JJ. And Chad is accused of murdering Tammy. And so we may never know exactly what happened, exactly how it was carried out. But anyway, when he says they used to get us both, when he's referencing that text, we learned in court yesterday that they is law enforcement, because
Right.
Chad and Lori thought law enforcement were dark, and they think that law enforcement is evil, and that they're going to use Alex to turn on them and give them up.
Right.
So that I thought was interesting. And Alex eventually died December.
Short time later,
Short time
actually
later.
wasn't. Yeah.
It's natural causes, but obviously very suspicious too.
Lots of questions. Yeah, you don't know. And Zulema, and he had only been married a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
When he passed away, we've talked before about the blessings and clearly
Yeah.
what appeared to be some manipulation going on there
Yes.
with Alex, and all of this. This divine, the divine messages that Chad said he was getting about Alex and about
Exactly.
the importance of his place here on earth as a warrior and a protector of Lori, and how valuable that was, really valiant his efforts were. We now, believe that based on the evidence presented by prosecutors, that what he was referencing was the killing of two children, of
Exactly.
Lori Vallow's two children. The other thing that was very interesting, and we have all of this phone call that I want to talk about, and it is in its entirety on our website, ktvb.com, as is all of this testimony, so you can see it all. But what an interesting phone call.
Yeah.
Lori Vallow is in jail. She has now been arrested, and Chad Daybell his property is getting ready to be searched.
But
right?
he's not necessarily in the know about
Right.
that. They serve the search warrant the next day.
But it's just one day later.
Yep.
But it's an interesting, just because of the timing and what we know in hindsight. So tell us about this phone call.
So this phone call was played while their lead detective, who you mentioned earlier, Ray Hermosillo, was on the stand. And they brought him back. He was the first one to testify in the trial. They brought him back just as they did with Doug Hart. And they played this phone call that they didn't play in Lori's trial.
Right.
And because it goes to the same point that Chad is the manipulator, Chad is the one with the death percentages. He's the one that everybody's turning to for this wisdom and advice and these patriarchal blessings and prayers. And so anyway, it's this phone call between Chad and Lori from June 8th of 2020 while Lori's in jail because she hasn't given up the kids.
Right.
And Chad it's the day before law enforcement serves a search warrant on his property and eventually finds the kids' bodies. But they're talking about a project, sort of a house renovation project.
Right.
And Chad is saying that Ray is the contractor in the project. So they keep referring to this Ray. And investigators learned throughout this investigation that they referred to Alex as Ray Lamar. You mentioned
Right.
that earlier.
Yeah.
He had a different name. And that Ray, by the way, at this point, Alex, is dead. As we just mentioned, he died in December. This is in June of the following year. And Chad is saying, because he has the ability to speak to the dead, that he has been texting with Ray. And Ray is saying, this project is going to work out. And Lori's like, okay, well, it's not working out.
Right.
I need you to go back to him and ask him,
What are we supposed to be doing?
what are we supposed to do? And Chad is saying, no, don't worry. This is part of the plan. There was always going to be some complication. And she's like, well, we were told there was only 3% issue, and now there's 100% issue. And that's very confusing. But she's essentially saying, you assured me, Alex assured me through you that everything was going to be fine, and now it's not. And this is, again, where they're talking about a project and
they
a
talk
plan.
about a pool, right? And how oftentimes when you go to put in a pool,
Yeah.
which is interesting because
they're
we're
talking
talking
about
about digging into a
Isn't it?
digging underground,
Isn't it? Yeah.
putting things into the ground, and how that never goes quite as planned, never goes perfectly. There are always delays. There are always things that happen that you don't expect.
Exactly.
And so, is this a metaphor? The same way that so much of this, when we have all these names as these metaphors, if you will, for other names for these things, you've heard all the different words that we use, that they've used to explain things going on in their life. They use these stories and these metaphors, and so is that what this is?
Yeah, I mean, that's what law enforcement is testifying to, right? And they talk about a blueprint, which, again, is a plan. And we heard in these text messages they had an orchestrated plan. I've transcribed it, and so I'm just looking at it now. But he's saying that he talked to Ray, and Ray was very optimistic, stick with it. And they just kind of keep going back and forth. But the theme of it is Lori's like pushing him. Lori's like pushing Chad. And Chad laughs a lot during this call. He's kind of like, ha, ha, ha. It's okay, honey. I think the most powerful part was, I got to find this, where she goes, how do you know?
Yeah.
I want to find this. And he says, I just know, honey, it was told to me, and I've seen those eyes fill with tears, and I've seen your wonderful body dance. And it's sort of this idea that they manipulate one another.
Right.
And it was very bizarre.
And I think you do also hear from her this, like you said, the pushing, remembering she's behind bars, she's in jail, she's not sure what's going to happen next. And clearly it sounds to me she has some anxiety and some nervousness about, you say it's going to all work out. It doesn't feel to me it is. And you and I are in a very different place, in a very different situation.
Yeah.
Again, not knowing that the very next day, law enforcement would be at his property with a search warrant and would uncover the bodies of JJ and Tylee on his property, which would also send him to jail as well.
Right.
And so, of course, that begins the charging process and all of that. But really interesting to just hear the mindset, but also how connected they continue to be, and how determined that it was all going to be okay, that they were going to be together. This was just a minor setback, and that now we have all of these people who were dark, who were zombies. That's another word that came up again, over and over, that all of these zombies were now out of their life, and just hang on, and we'll be together, living our our life.
Our fantasy
Yeah,
life. And
exactly.
Lori's like, what could I have done differently? You know, she keeps asking him, like, is there something that I'm looking back and I'm wondering, is there something that I could have done? And he's like, no, you know, you did everything right. It was supposed to be this way. And I don't know how they can think with her in jail that everything's going to work out in their favor. But it was interesting because they talked multiple times a day, every day.
Yeah.
And law enforcement, I mean, all those calls are recorded.
Of course.
Law enforcement listened to all of those. And so, of course, that's why they're speaking
And anyone
metaphors.
in jail knows that they are recorded.
Right.
They are told that they're recorded at the start
Right.
of every conversation, and oftentimes reminded throughout the conversation, depending on the system that they're using. But they often hear that reminder. Just like this evidence, though, that Hermosillo came up with and that Doug Hart was going through. I mean, they talked about tens of thousands of messages,
Oh, it was overwhelming.
pictures showing Alex and Chad together
Yes.
at the LDS temple, sharing information about, you know, the buddies and the bubbies, and you know, and being, you know, that they were themselves divine, and so much here. Really, when you talk about, you know, circumstantial evidence, yes,
Yes.
but piles and piles and piles of that.
Yeah, forensic data. I mean, that's how these cases are being solved these days. I mean, any of these big cases, you're able to go through iCloud accounts. That the messages Hart was going over were all from Lori's iCloud account.
Right.
You're going over GPS location data, Wi-Fi records, cell tower data, and trying to paint a picture. I try to imagine this case had these pieces of evidence not been here.
Yeah.
You know, maybe it was like 30 years
I was
ago.
going to say, decades ago, we wouldn't have had that type of
Right.
triangulation even possible.
But what you're not going to see in the same way with Lori's case, and jurors don't get to hear, hey, by the way, the co-conspirator was convicted.
Right.
You know, they may know that because they were exposed to previous media coverage about it, but they can't talk about the fact that she was found guilty, right?
And they can't use that to make their determination whether or not he is
Exactly.
guilty. That's just not part of their role.
No,
Yeah.
but the biggest thing is that you aren't, and again, we go back to we will never know how exactly these murders were, alleged murders were carried out. But I think a big thing is that you're not gonna see something in this forensic data, in this
Right.
evidence that says we killed the kids. Where should we bury the kids? We buried the kids here. You know, and so John
Right.
Pryor, his defense attorney, keeps going back to this. Like,
Yeah.
there's nothing explicitly that says this. So when he presents his defense next week, I think it'll be really interesting. We know that he does have witnesses he plans to call. He's kept a lot of them under subpoena that have previously testified.
Sure.
Unlikely he'll recall all of those. He's
Right.
got his own medical examiners. It's potentially his Chad Daybell's kids will testify.
Right.
At least one of them, maybe. Don't know how long that will last, but after he presents his defense,
Yeah.
then we go into jury deliberations.
Right.
And who knows how long that can take, but in Lori's case, it really only took about a day.
Yeah, it wasn't very long at
Yeah,
all.
and they came back with a verdict, guilty on all counts. So with Chad, they'll come back to that, and then it goes immediately into the penalty phase if he's
Sentencing phase,
convicted,
yeah.
and that will be another mini trial, and that will be really interesting because I'm actually very interested in that.
Yeah.
I've never personally covered anything like this. I don't know if you
I
have.
have, yeah.
You have. It's fascinating because it goes to the character of the defendant.
Right, exactly. It's all about whether or not this punishment. So now we go into, is this punishment what is correct? And then we start looking at mitigating factors. And
Exactly.
does this crime fit the criteria in law, in Idaho law, that says, you know, lays out what has to be true in order for you to even come up with a death penalty
Right.
sentence. But it is a mini trial, exactly right. So different than a judge imposing the trial or the sentence, which is what we saw Judge Boyce do for Lori Vallow's case last year. This will be up to the juror to determine whether or not the death penalty is appropriate. And so all of those things that come into like a pre-sentence investigation
Yep.
that is then turned over to the judge for him her to consider. Now the jury will hear that.
And it's the same jury. It's the same
Yes.
jury that comes back with the conviction. And
Yeah.
all of these jurors had to be open to imposing the death
Absolutely, yeah.
penalty, you know? So, I don't know if it'll last the full 2 weeks. They're estimating, right? But it could be 4 days, we'll see. And then it'll be aggravating factors, mitigating factors that'll be presented from both sides. And we'll see what comes of that. But I think it'll be done. It's sounding like first or second week of June.
Yeah.
So right on track. I think, and a lot of this, the way that prosecutors, I can't imagine being a juror in this case. With hindsight, looking back on Lori's trial, it all makes sense as a reporter. And I've been sitting in the courtroom with jurors from Lori's
Right.
trial.
Yeah, and we hope to bring them here and talk to them next week.
Yeah. They're, I mean, and it's fascinating because I go to them and I say, hey, did this make sense to you when this was being presented
Right.
last year? And they're, no. But now we realize how much weight that specific text message carried,
Yeah.
right? When Chad was looking up the wind direction and texting about the raccoon on a specific
Right.
date and how that matched up. You know, I think I can't imagine how difficult, though, this case is for the jurors and how much they just have to sift through. And so we thank them, of course, for their service, too, in this.
And just like you said, the burden, the responsibility, it is huge, it is massive, but also just the in terms of being so true to what they promised to do,
Yeah.
because that is exactly what they've said, and I hope to hear that from the jurors
I hope so, too.
next week, because I like you said, getting inside their mind and recognizing that what may seem like an innocuous, almost irrelevant,
mundane,
message,
yeah.
exactly about why would that matter. When you start to see it all come together, and I think that's exactly what Doug Hart was able to show the jurors too, is just by prosecutors putting those back to back to back to see that pattern exist. You know, here's this happening, now someone's dead. Here's this happening, now the two children are
very
dead.
critical.
Yeah, and so it will be also very interesting to see as the defense opens their case next week. Of course, we will be there. We'll follow along, and we will bring you the next episode of Inside the Courtroom.